What do I do with my hands?
Can you stand slightly closer?
Alright, what's up, you guys? We're reviving... Alright, what's up, you guys? We're bringing back hot and cold takes. So we got your controversial lifting opinions, and I'm gonna read them to Sam and get his response. In case you're new or you forgot, we also have the Hot Take Award, which we'll be giving out to opinions that are genuinely controversial and also Sam agrees with. We were also thinking that once the channel gets bigger, we'll start sending out like a merch or something for the Hottest Take Award every time we do a video, so... Alright, hot take, the left-right training split would work.
Left-right training split. Sick. I can't give you the award because I think everybody agrees with you that it could work. None of us want to do it though, because fucking why? But absolutely, you are correct, it could work.
Alright, wrist curls and extensions, not just grip work, are worth bothering with. Bigger forearms means more stable pressing.
So, yes, on some level, absolutely. If we are emptying the kitchen sink to improve our bench press, we can find the room in the week for these little marginal things that are going to make a small difference. I think, for example, Jimmy Kolb, the multiply bench press record holder, I think he does direct forearm flexor and wrist extensor training because he's trying to get any little percentage he can. Where I'm going to push back on you is people chasing kind of whole body development and they want to be strong at things other than just benching. There's a very high chance I can find something that ranks higher in terms of our priorities, in terms of like things we want to do. Now, early on, when we can do 1 billion exercises and all of them are hard, yeah, maybe we can sneak them in there. But as you get stronger and training economy becomes a little bit harder to come by, I think that's one of the first things to go. Maybe in the off season, maybe if you know you have tremendous issues with wrist stability, but I don't see that in a ton of athletes. I think that if you engage with the bar right in your hand, maybe not. So I think, yeah, if we're being a bench specialist and we're chasing every little like 0.5% we can, absolutely, I do think it makes sense. But I think if we're chasing whole body development and we have other major motor patterns we need to work on, that's probably going to go by the wayside. I think when people try to check every single box that hypothetically could help a little bit, they either manage their fatigue poorly and get fucking buried, or the other thing that will happen is they end up just sandbagging so much of their work to be able to get in all of these hypothetical little marginal things. And I'm very guilty of this myself because I'm like, this exercise has this cool, unique benefit that I don't get from anything else. It needs to be in my program. You need to be willing to forsake some cool little novel benefits to flip the big rocks. Leave the little rocks for maybe when we're specializing on something specific. So no hot take award for you.
All right, next one. Pull-ups and dips are notably...
Oh, is this Paris as well?
Yes. Pull-ups and dips are notably worse hypertrophy exercises if you add more than 15 to 20% of your body weight to them. About 30 to 45 pounds if you weigh around 200 to 220.
So this is a really good one. I saw this one. I texted Paris. I was like, this is a well-crafted hot take because I've had several people screenshot this in there and send it to me and be like, what the fuck is this? This doesn't make any sense. How would overloading a good hypertrophy movement make it a worse hypertrophy movement? And like, obviously, if we go like no charity at all, dumb as fuck. Paris is a terrible take. But if we get into what he means, right, he's saying that the vast majority of athletes, when they try to progress to that point, they're not strong enough to do, let's say, a bodybuilding technique, like optimizing hypertrophy outcomes, technique version of a pull-up or a dip, right? Because good form depends on our goal. Right? Good form for a powerlifter is using as many muscles as we can, moving at the least distance we can legally, and moving as efficiently from point A to point B as possible. Whereas good technique for bodybuilding, good technique for hypertrophy outcomes, in many ways is the opposite. Good technique will make it as stressful as possible on the target muscle. So in some ways, we're trying to be as inefficient and make a muscle do as much work as possible rather than splitting the load between different muscle groups, right? So kind of once we have that out of the way of like, okay, well, good technique depends on the outcome. Paris is saying that most guys he sees in the gym, when they start throwing a plate on their pull-ups, go from a good bodybuilding oriented pull-up to a strength training oriented pull-up. So the way, let's say, a street lifter might do their pull-ups, where they're trying to be as powerful and efficient moving from A to B. And he's saying they would get better gains if they stayed within the realm of what they could do with that bodybuilding centric form. Now, hypothetically, could there be a guy that's so strong he can do bodybuilding perfect technique with 2 plates on the pull up and 3 plates on the dip. Yes, absolutely, in which case Paris would be wrong, right? It's the same movement. But that being said, he's saying for the vast majority of people he sees, they go from form type A to form type B to get to these margins. And I think that's actually a pretty good point. So checks the box of genuinely controversial, considering people screenshotted it and sent it to me. And I think there's a good bit of truth there. But where I'm going to push back, I still might give him the hot take because I thought this was really, really good, right? There's like some nuance there of like, well, what does he actually mean? Where I will push back is I do agree. Most guys I see in the gym, even pretty strong guys, will move to more of a street lifting style of pull-up when they get to like 1 plate because they're trying to overload as the goal. They're not trying to stimulate the muscle as the goal. Is it still very effective? Yes. Would Paris argue it's slightly more effective? Sure. Honestly, decent take. I don't think you have to be that strong to do 1 plate with very bodybuilding centric technique on the dip. I don't think you have to be a freak. You don't have to be a dip world record holder to do that more bodybuilding oriented dip at a plate or 2 plates. I do see athletes that can do like a nice deep, good mind muscle connection, good control, good intent, forceful, concentric. It's not rare. So I agree with that margin of like observational. Yeah, guys might be getting worse gains, weight chasing their pull-ups after a certain margin, but I don't actually agree on the dip, at least with the specific number that you gave. But I thought this was a pretty clever one. Hot take award awarded.
Microloading your accessory movements is the best way to make progress on them long term. Adding 1/2 to 1 pound per week, or 1% of the total load, not only allows your body to keep up and adapt to the demand you're placing on it, it also is extremely difficult to plateau.
Yeah, so microloading, one of the big critiques you'll hear people make of like these like 1 pound increments is that 1 pound is lost in the variance of non-calibrated plates. So are you actually doing this really precise overload that's super in sync with your muscles, or did you grab different plates this week, right?
What was the plate in our garage that was so much heavier than the other? We had a pair of the same ones, and it was like
it was like 49 and a half was one of them, and then one of them was 45. So like, it's a 5 pound discrepancy.
And they were from the same set.
Yeah, they were from the same set. They were matching plates. So that's a common critique you'll hear brought up, right? Maybe you're lifting on calibrated plates. Ultimately, if that meshes well with you psychologically, I don't think it's the worst idea in the world. It's no different than just step loading slightly larger jumps and building reps for a little bit longer, and then you make a 5 pound jump. Instead, you build reps for a little bit shorter, and you make those jumps more frequently. It's ultimately the same thing, and I think the degree of sustainability is really about the same. But if you like that idea, I'm not entirely averse to it. The big thing that I would like push back on is a lot of the people that I think are like really, they like this idea of the microloading. It ends up making it so that way they're progressing it so slow, and they're like, I'm to be able to do this forever. And they spend like several months doing ultimately what is too submaximal of work, because it's like, oh, I easily did, let's say my target is 12 reps. I did 200 pounds for easy, 3 sets of 12. I had 1 pound the next week, right? But it was easy, right? This was probably falling short of what is effective work. Yes, we're checking the box of overload, but really what matters more? The overload, or are we checking that box of 3 difficult sets of this exercise? We can kind of auto-regulate the weights as needed. I would argue that the understanding that what our muscles know is the 3 difficult sets, almost just as much, if not more, than that overload component. In terms of growth stimulus, in terms of a strength stimulus, yeah, sure. But I would say that's the one thing I would urge you against is people that really like small jumps end up for the sake of sustainability and knowing that they could progress it forever, sandbagging their training for progressive period, for very long periods of time. So that would be one thing that comes to mind.
I would say, we used it for my bench programming at one point. I was benching 3 times a week, and being able to make 2.5 pound jumps made it so that I didn't have to do the same weight 3 times. Because this is when I benched less, so the percent jumps wouldn't always lead to a 5 pound jump.
Absolutely, you'll hear people mention that. It's like for lifts with a lesser absolute load, or smaller women or newer women to the gym, where using a percentage-based program potentially would just lead to doing the same weight several times, especially if you don't have access to 2.5s. You want to get some 2.5s. A smaller woman progressing their overhead press. Does adding that little micro plate on there instead of just building more reps at 60, and we're doing 62.5 instead, does that really make it that much more potent of a stimulus? Probably not. We could have just built reps at 60 and probably seen a very similar rate of progression, but it keeps it a lot more mentally fresh, not having to do the same weight session after session after session, which is why I kind of mentioned that like psychologically it can be sick, but no hot take award.
All right, junk food, pizza, sushi, and other, as an addition to a good nutrient-dense diet, may be a natural enhancement and one of the best ways to up your body weight and gain strength and size.
A natural enhancement.
Natural enhancement.
Well, so yeah, for sure, it's the best way to up your body weight, right? Like hyper palatable food is the best way to increase. It's just the easiest way to get into a big caloric surplus. So absolutely, you're correct. It's the easiest way to increase your body weight. And yeah, when you are increasing your body weight, you can see pretty sick strength gains. Make people wary of this is like guys will become really overly reliant on that caloric surplus to kind of pad poor effort or poor work capacity in the gym. And then they get really fat and they hate how they look, even though they told themselves they didn't care. And then they need to cut. And because they were so reliant on that caloric surplus to band-aid some problems in their training that they then need to cut, and their strength comes way back because it was a band-aid. Could you read more of that specifics? I'm trying to make sure I engage with this because there's a decent point here, right? I'm not gonna fucking straw man and be like fatty.
He's saying it's just one of the best ways to up your body weight and gain strength and size.
Yeah, so hypothetically, right, if we get into that same caloric surplus with more nutrient, I mean, actually the nutrient density on most cheap foods, it depends what it is, right? Like, sure, potato chips, poor nutrient density. Pizza, just because the cheese does have a good bit of, it's a dairy product. It's like a lot of the calories are coming from a dairy product, a burger, right? Sushi. The micros actually aren't terrible.
Do you think that's why? Because anecdotally, if you eat a bunch of quote unquote junk food, you feel pretty strong.
Yeah, I mean, you're eating a hypercaloric diet, which we know is like probably number one thing, right? Pushing our body weight upward. You're going to end up at a reasonable amount of protein, especially if we're talking like burgers and pizza and sushi. So we're checking those two maybe most important boxes. And the micros
sodium.
So we get tons of sodium. We're going to retain a lot of water, which tends to make us strong the next day. And also, Stan Everett always talks about if you eat horizontal instead of vertical, the one thing it does really well when we eat these really varied diets is we are probably checking our boxes on a lot of our micros. Right, his whole thing was like, yeah, you're checking your boxes with your micros, but you're wrecking your stomach. Now, if you're young and it doesn't wreck your stomach, and that's the only way you can get in enough calories, yeah, lean into a little bit of dirty food. People will justify that into making it more and more. Like you said, it's to supplement a good diet, not to replace a good diet. Everybody goes down that route, and then they realize they've taken it a little bit too far. But if you're really struggling to get in a caloric surplus, hyper-palatable food are good. And he's like, yeah, no, Brian Shaw was eating horizontal. He was getting his micronutrients. And that's why, like, he was getting into a surplus, he was getting his protein, and he was getting his micros. And that's why it was working just fine, and it brought him to his first World's Strongest Man win. Eventually, just constantly being in a state of, like, gastric distress, as that would lead to a lot of people, not all, is just an extra stressor on the body and isn't great. So I would tell you that, like, hypothetically, if you can eat that same number of calories in nothing but your good nutrient-rich, digestion-friendly diet, that would be even better. But a lot of the time, people don't have the time or the mental resources or the appetite to get to that same level of calories. So eating like 2 or 3 clean meals and then 1 cheat meal is the only way they can get into a surplus when they're trying to gain weight. In which case, yes, it absolutely is a very good idea, though people start to get addicted to it and then kind of rationalize eating, 2 of my meals are cheats, 3 of my meals are cheats. This whole clean eating thing is overrated. That's my hot take. It's like, is it, or are you just constantly shitting yourself, but you really, really like pizza, right? Like, so
is it a natural enhancement or not?
That sounds so... yes, it's absolutely a natural enhancement. Badass. Let's go.
Most lifters would see better gains in the long term just running base phases / general strength and bodybuilding phases repeatedly and never peaking to 1 to 3 rep maxes. Time spent peaking up to a lift that's probably still in the dial tier in relation to your own potential is time wasted. You could have spent growing more and getting in quality reps, etc.
Okay, this is a good take. This was very much my philosophy. A lot of my lifting career was just, I understood the whole gaining muscle is kind of paramount. And so I was scared to get away from anything I felt wasn't building muscle. What's the point of peaking to fucking 250? That's shit. Why would I do that, right? And on some level, yes, it is time spent away from building. So I think you're onto something here, and I would be lying if I told you I didn't think that philosophy of I always want to be doing something that's kind of relevant to building muscle and building my base. What's the point of peaking to something shitty? I'd be lying if I told you I didn't think that served me well. But now that I'm coaching younger guys who have the same philosophy, I do think you miss some little things, right? Like doing heavy singles is a skill. Guys who are terrified of are always putting in volume end up being disproportionately skilled at the volume, and just doing a little bit of more maximal lifting to work on that skill of displaying maximal strength would be the amount it takes away from the volume you do afterward, especially when we're not moving huge absolute loads, isn't that much. We don't want to do it all the time. I think there's a tremendous amount of value to what you're describing, but I do see with some of my athletes that are really scared of it, like, hey, 1 week away to just practice the skill of lifting heavier. There's skills associated with warming up for a peaking phase, right? Just like how there's different skills that lead to a guy who's like crushes his hypertrophy phases and gains more muscle than his genetically identical counterpart. He nails his nutrition, he nails his technique, blah, blah, blah. Like he gets how to do an effective hypertrophy phase. The only way to be the guy that gets how to do an effective peaking phase, you gotta do them a little bit, right? Now you can do a soft peak where you keep in a lot of your resistance work instead of dropping them out like you might for a contest, to kind of keep your foot on the gas in terms of muscle gain. And you're not wrong, right? Because absolutely from a muscle gain perspective, that is still a small step away from productive work, but there's a skill side to this whole thing. Just like how I'm sure you can imagine what those habits are of a guy who crushes his hypertrophy phase and sets up a good strength phase every time. There's also skills to the peaking phase, and I've met guys that have taken that philosophy too far and are underskilled every time it comes around to the peaking phase, or they're anxious every time it happens. They're just so itchy to get back to it that they do a really poor job. So that would be something I would be aware of, but I think that you're onto something. You're right. You have a good understanding of what you need to do to get better. I would just say, hey, don't be scared of just doing like one sub-maximal single before you go do this base building work. It's not going to take away very much, and it can help you develop some skills that you will be thankful you built later, right? Down the line, you'll be like, thank God I built all this muscle. God, I wish I just did a little bit more work on, like, those heavy singles can be great technique work, because big part of technique is not just like what you can move the empty bar like, it's how you can display that strength with the maximal weight that's trying to impose breakdown on you. So that would be my warning as someone who does still think about it that exact same way, probably to a fault. I think you're onto something, but no hot take.
Yeah, Mr. I have skipped peaking phases maybe too many times.
Yes, that's right.
What you eat the day before you lift matters more than what you eat on the day you lift.
I like this one. So obviously if you lift at like 7 p.m. like Max does, no, right? You have a full day of eating that day of, and you can probably make up for a relatively poor prior day. But if you lift like anything shy of the afternoon, I don't know if that's true. I don't know a way to measure that exactly, because yeah, same thing. If you eat poorly the day of, you're also going to have a poor day. Ideally, we do both. The whole YouTube obsession of if you could only do one. It's like, well, if you only do one, you're probably going to be ass. Let's do a decent job with both rather than perfect on one. But I think this is a really good observation, and I've had a similar observation myself within my own training. I'm not confident enough to tell you that like this is bang on, but I still might give you the hot take award just because I've had a similar observation myself. That's why I had to start moving like, hey, I'm preparing for this heavy priority session. I've been thinking about it. It used to be, oh, well, the morning of, make sure I drink my water, I eat my meals, I do a little bit of mobility, I make sure I go on my walks, so that way I feel good on this day, right? And that was like a year into lifting, 2 years into lifting. That was how I understood it. And as I got better at this, as I got stronger, it became, well, no, a prep phase for a big session isn't the day of, it's the day of and the day before. And when I switched, that idea of prepping includes the day before, and that's both sleep, nutrition, making sure you move throughout the day, hydration, my result, like the degree to which I predictably had the good session I was hoping for, quadrupled, right? I would do the good day of, and sometimes it would be good, sometimes it would be bad. It would be more consistent than if I didn't prep at all. Then it would be a real random dice roll. But when I started including the day prior in my prep, I very reliably started having a good day on that big session I wanted to feel strong on. And as I've gotten stronger and stronger, unfortunately, prepping for a big session has built its way out to a fucking week of making sure I'm really on the ball to make sure I really reliably have a very strong day. But I think for the vast majority of lifters, if we can encompass day of and day before, and day before maybe being more important especially if we include like this going to bed early in that, not just the food. Yeah, day before is the shit for preparing for a big session. Don't just try to sort it out day of. That will not work for very long.
CNS fatigue from lifting heavy is the same type of fatigue from any other set, but people fail to see it as such. And he says he thinks part of it is because you're more sore and tired from like a set of 10, whereas you might not feel as sore from a single. Yeah.
Okay, so that's actually, at first I was like knee jerk, I don't like this, right? Very good point, right? People are overly reliant. I'll try to keep this fast, but there's a couple cool things we could touch on here. People are overly reliant on soreness as their proxy for fatigue when some kinds of training doesn't produce a tremendous amount of like local muscular soreness. So we need to become a little bit more adept at identifying fatigue different ways. So that could be your sleep quality falls off, your appetite falls off, you're a little bit mentally foggy, your mental health gets poor. Your body's very slow to warm up. Experienced lifter will be able to cite all of these things that they know are indicators that they're in a fatigued state, but newer lifters tend to be overly reliant on soreness. So yeah, after you do a bunch of heavy singles, you might not be sore the next day, but your performance is going to be fucking nuked. And you're like, yeah, so that's fatigue. I do think that there is a little bit of differential, like functionally, is just thinking of fatigue as fatigue pretty useful. Yes, absolutely. But we do want to differentiate, right? Because there's kind of soft tissue damage is a little bit different, but there's probably some differentiation between localized fatigue and kind of holistic fatigue. I see a lot of people push back and say that CNS fatigue is probably not the right term. We're just going to call it holistic fatigue, right? If we max out our deadlift today, our bench press will be down tomorrow, right? What you just referred to as general fatigue, and fair enough, but we can also see a slight difference in something that we would think of as local fatigue, right? If we we do a crazy bicep workout, right? The next day, our bicep strength is going to be down like 50%, 40% reduced. It's going to be a sharp fall off. But our bench press, if we go to bench press that next day, it's going to be perfectly high. So we see this big acute fatigue, we see this big acute fall off in bicep performance because there's local fatigue, but we don't see that same holistic effect like if we did the big deadlift. Don't know exactly where it cut me off, but we don't see that same exact like huge fall off, right? So it's like we do a big deadlift, we bench press the next day, and maybe our bench press is down up to, I don't know, terrible day, 10% down. Due to this more holistic fatigue, right? Well, if we do bicep curls, our bicep curl performance might be down even more than that, but we don't see that same level of decrease in non-primary movers from the prior day. So there's some amount of like localized fatigue there, as well as that kind of holistic throttling of force output. Does this matter that much? Not if you have reasonable programmed, like if your split is reasonable, probably doesn't matter as much. So I think there's a lot of validity to what you're saying. But if we wanted to get really technical, we can probably differentiate those kinds of fatigue at least a little bit.
Maintenance phases, as described by RP, are a waste of precious time. Also, the second battery for some reason is going to die. The second battery for some reason is going to die, so go fast.
Okay, maintenance phases. We got into this in the Discord. For bodybuilding, I think holding your body weight at the end of a bottom of a cut, not really a good use of time. Stupid. I think you should start working your way back up once you complete it. Holding your body weight at the top of a bulk. I actually don't mind this for bodybuilding. You could say hypothetically that time could be better spent, but I do think that when we're still in that like kind of overly fat state, our body has a lot of resources at its disposal. Just putting in a little bit longer, holding that weight, it tends to produce a good result, even just purely anecdotal. All right. Hi, fellas. Editor Sam here. I forgot to finish where the battery cut me off there. I won't go into too much here. For bodybuilding, I think hanging out at the bottom of a cut, not really a great use of time. Anecdotally, hanging out at the top of the cut, putting in some more training at that kind of strongest point. Our body has a lot of resources at its disposal. Guys in the Discord were arguing, yeah, but you'd be even better off in a surplus. Time spent in not a surplus or a deficit is time that could be better spent. I anecdotally said that I do think hanging out at the top weight of a bulk is a decent use of time. That is just my opinion. Probably both ways work just fine. If you're adamant that you should always be cutting or bulking, yeah, fair enough, that's fine. But for strength athletes, I very strongly disagree. I think periods of maintenance are phenomenal for strength athletes. I know you guys hear me yap and yap and yap about, ooh, cross-sectional area. So then, well, that means optimal bodybuilding practices are optimal strength training practices, but just time spent accruing really good training is awesome. So it's like if we are making good progress with our training and we're putting in week after week of really solid productive training at maintenance, we're hanging out there. That way we don't have an inevitable time cap on it. If we were in a surplus, eventually we would get excessively heavy relative to our weight class, and we would need to pump the brakes on accumulating this week after week after week of awesome training. And then we would have to cut and we'd have to pump the brakes on that training. So I really do think that for strength athletes, there's definitely plenty of times through the year that you might want to be eating at maintenance. I see your argument for bodybuilding though.
Lifting is overrated for hypertrophy and strength.
Hot take. Sick. Let's go. Overrated as fuck.
Tracking accessories past your first 2 main movements is a waste of time. It's usually more anxiety and data than it's worth.
So I thought that was a great one. I can't give you a hot take because different athletes have different psychology. Some people, it's just it doesn't give them a bunch of latent anxiety. It just gives them an accountability system for their effort. So newer lifters, I think tracking all the way through is good because it teaches you how far you can push yourself if you don't have a prior sporting history and you don't know how to push yourself. Just trying to do more than you did last week is a great way to calibrate just how hard you can push yourself, so it's valuable there. When we start getting to more advanced lifters, maybe that bifurcates. Some people are very accountable. They're going to work hard. They're just hardworking guys. And in which case, the logbook might just make them shittily weight chase, and they deviate from the form that actually is the best means to an end of what we're trying to get out of that assistance work. So it's like they start making their tricep press down shitty to chase overload when really what we want is a good growth stimulus. So it actually hurts them, or maybe it gives them anxiety about those lower tier motions. But other guys, they understand the logbook is what it is, and it's just an accountability system to make sure that even on your worst day, you're giving an effort comparable to the prior week. So I think that really depends on how the athlete interprets it. All right, thank you guys for your hot takes. We're going to try to keep this series going maybe every other week or something. If you're scrolling through Instagram, you see some lifting stuff, and you have a controversial take, keep us in mind. We'll put the thing up for these. Keep it in the back of your head so we can keep having an interesting discussion.